Perfect. Thanks very much for having me out today. Thanks very much, Mercy, for the introduction. Like Mercy said, I had done my master's here a long time ago. It's nice to see some familiar faces around and lots of new faces doing some cool wildlife ecology work here at the U of S. So I wanted the chance to come talk to you today because I don't think a lot of people know exactly what goes on at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. We're down based in Regina, and it's a bit of an unknown, I think, about what we do. So my talk will be kind of in two different parts. The first part will be talking a little bit about the provincial collection of biodiversity that we have at the museum and talk a little bit about some of the education and the outreach that we do. And then the second part of my talk will give you a little bit of a teaser on two projects, research projects that I'm involved with at the museum in collaboration with the University of Regina. And hopefully throughout, I'll sprinkle some ideas about how we might be able to collaborate a little bit better between the museum, academic institutions, and wildlife ecologists here in the province. So not going to give you too long of a history lesson, but just to give you a little bit of background on the museum. So we were established in 1906, so we're getting up 115-ish years old. We are currently part of the provincial government, so we're in the Ministry of Parks, Culture and Sport. So everyone that works at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum is a provincial employee. We have just over 30 staff, kind of in 4 different parts of the museum. So most of our staff are kind of frontline staff doing education and programming at the main building at the museum. We have lots of folks like graphic designers who work on our exhibits and programming. I'm particularly in the research and collections unit, and I'll spend most of my talk talking about what we do in that unit. And if you didn't know, we also run the East End T-Rex Center if you've ever been out there. If you haven't, it's a pretty awesome place to visit. So if you've never been to the museum, to the RSM, take the opportunity to get down to Regina and go check it out. So you can, in terms of the natural history part of the museum, I think we have some of the best dioramas representing biodiversity that I've actually ever seen in a North American museum or even a world museum. You can walk through all of the ecoregions of Saskatchewan, see a bunch of different types of biodiversity at the main museum building. We also have an amazing First Nations gallery and a paleontology gallery as well with Scotty, the biggest T-Rex. But what a lot of people don't know is that what's on display at the main building is probably less than like 5% of what we actually have in the provincial collection. And that occurs and is stored in a completely different building than the main RSM building. And like I said, at least in my opinion, that's where a lot of the magic happens and what I'm going to talk about today. So we kind of have 3 main goals at the RSM. So one of the first goals, and I'll talk about each of these and sort of give you some examples of what we do, but one of our main goals is to kind of collect and preserve natural history and artifacts related to Indigenous cultures. That's one of our main goals at the RSM. We do a lot of education and outreach, communicating that knowledge about natural history, Indigenous cultures in the community. And then a lot of the curators specifically are adjunct faculty members, mostly at the University of Regina, but at a few other universities here in Canada. So we're engaged in and we lead different research projects around Canada and within Saskatchewan. So like I said, one of the main goals is to preserve specimens of biodiversity in Saskatchewan, or natural history. But we have some other different collections. So I'll talk quite a bit more about our vertebrate collection. We also have an invertebrate zoology collection at the RSM. We have a small botany collection. We have a paleontology collection. So our paleontologists are really interested in, of course, dinosaurs, but also a big focus on insects trapped in amber is one of the research focus of our curator of paleontology. We have an Indigenous Studies collection, which includes a lot of sacred cultural items. We have a really good relationship with a lot of the First Nations in the area who come in to bless our collection and things like that. And then we have some smaller collections, library, and a fine art collection. Those are really, really small. So to give you a little bit of an idea, our invertebrate zoology collection, our specimens primarily come from the wild in Canada and the US. Our curator of invertebrate zoology, Corey Sheffield, is a world-renowned expert in bees. And so our collection is growing substantially in terms of native bees in North America. This map on the right is where about our 80,000-ish specimens of native bees come from across North America. In general, our invertebrate collection is pushing up over 400,000 inverts right now. So lots of inverts, easy to collect, obviously, harder to identify. Our vertebrate zoology collection is primarily focused on vertebrates coming from the wild in Saskatchewan, although we do have specimens from all over North America and the world. And think of us as a little bit of a library representing snapshots of biodiversity over space and time in Saskatchewan. This is a map of our bird collection where most of our ornithology specimens come from. So really focused on southern Saskatchewan, kind of extending up into northern Saskatchewan, and a few specimens from around North America as well. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what we have, I was just with Tracy in your collection here at the U of S, and it's an amazing collection that you have here. And so kind of nice to have a couple institutions in the province cataloging biodiversity over time. So our collection, we have about just approaching 10,000 individual birds in the collection, representing about 420 different species. Mammals, we're at about 3,700, representing about 126 different species, primarily limited to small mammals and medium-sized mammals, so kind of anything smaller than a skunk or raccoon. We have about 500 individual reptiles, about 120 individual amphibians, representing 105-ish species, and we have about 350 fish, representing about 64 different species. The other unique collection that we have at the RSM is a collection of owl pellets. So if you don't know, when owls eat something, they can't digest lots of the bones. They throw it up as a pellet, and then lovely museum people like us come along, pick it up. And we're able to dissect those pellets and identify a lot of the small mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians in those owl pellets. So we have a collection of about 10,000 owl pellets, and that represents about 92,000 vertebrates in that particular collection. So one of the best ways to survey for small mammals and look at small mammal diversity in the province. And that collection is primarily from Saskatchewan and Alberta. We also have a fairly significant egg collection. So we have about 780 eggs, representing about 150-ish species of birds, and about 260 nests, everything from mud nests of a grebe to small hummingbird nests. We maintain that and care for it in the long term. So you're probably asking yourself, where do all of these things come from? And it's a really good question. So back in the day, my predecessors, probably 30 years ago, 20 years ago, would go out specifically on expeditions to collect things and add them to the museum collection. That's changed quite a bit. Public perception is obviously one of the issues that we deal with as a museum. And so we actually don't do a lot of active vertebrate collection anymore, other than the owl pellets and some small mammal trapping in the last couple of years. But physically going out as curators, collecting something and bringing it back, we don't do that much anymore. But we do get a ton of stuff in from different sources around the province. So we get stuff from academics. If you're out doing field work and you find something dead, people can bring it to the museum to add to the collection. We have a really good relationship with Ministry of Environment. So they've got offices all over the province. They get in a lot of raptors and waterfowl and things like that. And that eventually makes its way to the museum. We have a great relationship with Living Sky here in Saskatoon and Salthaven in Regina. So any animals that come into their care and they don't make it, they're brought to the RSM to add to the collection. In Regina, and I think it's going on in Saskatoon through Living Sky, there's some citizen science programs that are going out to look for bird mortalities in the fall. So we get all of those birds at the RSM as well. And we get lots of people that just find dead stuff in their backyard, on their ranch, on their acreage. They think it's cool and they want to donate it to the museum. And so they can do that as well. So even though we don't actively collect on the vertebrate side, we probably get between 200 and 300 things coming in a year to the RSM. It is typically limited to some of the bigger cities though, Regina, Prince Albert, Saskatoon. So once we get a specimen, then we go through the preparation of it. So a lot of people think maybe we just skin it, chuck it in the collection, but there's a ton of morphological data that we do take as part of the preparation process. So for birds, we do things like wing chord, length, hallux, anything else you can think of. We take a ton of measurements. We measure the gonads if we're able to. And to the best of our ability, we try to age and sex everything that comes in to the RSM. So it's probably kind of give you a little bit of an idea of how stuff is stored and why we store it that particular way. So everyone who's taken an undergraduate class is totally familiar with a study skin. It's a bird on a stick, essentially, is what we call it. It's obviously not a lifelike pose, but it allows us to store a large number of specimens in a really small drawer space, essentially. But this maintains some useful scientific information and maintains things like coloration. All those morphological characteristics can still be used from and measured from study skins. And it does preserve tissues. So things like fur, feathers, skin, etc., is all kind of maintained when we store something as a study skin. Now, we do get some stuff in that is in really rough shape. But just because it's in a rough shape doesn't mean it's not useful for the museum. If something comes in and we don't think it'll prepare well as a study skin, we typically make a skeleton out of whatever comes in. We have a lovely little colony of divested or flesh-eating beetles that do most of the work for us to prepare the skeletons. And a lot of information associated with those skeletons, just as valuable for us as those study skins. So maintains those morphological characteristics. Some folks have used the skeleton collection to age things from tooth rings and things like that. So just, you know, lots of people think if they find something and it's not absolutely perfect that we don't want it. But we do, because we can do things like this to add to the collection. Now, the other thing that we do have a lot of are taxidermy mounts. And these are animals in lifelike poses, in lifelike behaviors. This is a ton of investment in both time and money to prepare taxidermy mounts, and they take up a ton of space. So if you remember that drawer that I just showed a picture of, that's probably the same amount of space as this eagle takes up. And it's one eagle versus like 50 small warblers in a study skin form. So we don't do a lot of taxidermy in-house anymore, if at all, other than kind of for educational purposes. But it maintains a lot of useful information. All the plumage is still maintained, all the fur is maintained. Those morphological characteristics are maintained. So it's kind of a unique part of what we have in the museum collection. We do also store a lot of stuff in a wet form for a lot of the soft-bodied things. So our predominantly fish, reptile, and amphibian collection are stored in a wet form. But in our case, having a ton of that flammable material is a really hard thing to store. So we're actually not looking to expand this part of the collection right at this particular time, although we are more than happy to take stuff in and keep it until we can. Then the other thing that we started to do since about 2010 is that everything that's prepared and added into the collection, we take a small sample of liver, heart, and muscle tissue. and that's frozen, associated with the specimen. So we know where the specimen was collected, we know when, and we've got all of the tissue available for anyone to use, essentially. Great for genetic analyses, stable isotope stuff, anything else that requires some sort of tissue. That's why we store this information. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of some cool things in the collection, Tracy one-upped me though. I'll show you a little bit later. But our oldest one is a female wood duck from 1899, which was collected in Ontario and donated to the RSM. So, you know, pushing 120 years old and still looking pretty good. One thing that I forgot to mention, all of our specimens are stored in kind of a temperature controlled area. We do frequent sweeps for pests to make sure there's no pests. And everything is holding up really, really nicely 120 some odd years later. Our oldest Saskatchewan specimen is this chestnut-collared longspur that was collected from southwestern Saskatchewan. I think it was around Console, Saskatchewan. There's kind of a neat story behind this one. This was from a British expedition up to northern Saskatchewan in 1905. They collected this common loon egg. So we're preserving and keeping things like eggs around now for 100 and some plus years, which is pretty cool. Tracy, she showed me your passenger pigeon. I was like, oh, I thought we had the only passenger pigeon, but we do have a couple passenger pigeons, which is kind of neat, extirpated species in the world, and so it's pretty interesting to be able to see some of those things up close. We do have some other interesting ones. Lots of greater prairie chickens that were collected in Saskatchewan that are now extirpated in the province here. Greater sage grouse, there's probably less than 100 in the wild now, and we have some of those. And then we have some rarer things like wolverine and red-headed woodpecker, which are relatively low densities across the province. So you're probably asking yourself, that's great that they're like collecting all this and keeping it for the long term. So, but what is it used for? And the primary purpose is to make it available for research purposes. So a couple examples, we've been working with a retired prof out of the University of Manitoba, who's doing a bunch of work on cowbirds and trying to trace brown-headed cowbird distribution across the prairies historically. So he's going way back into some of our collection from the early 1900s and looking for cowbird eggs that were collected as part of another clutch. We were working with Kevin and Adam there to do some tissue sampling of aerial insectivores. And then we worked with graduate students who are doing population structure and genetic type work. So we had a student doing some work on gray jays and woodpeckers who grabbed specimens from our collection and were able to use them in their research and their thesis. So, so really, you know, we want to get the word out that all of these specimens are there, and we're very keen to collaborate if anyone has research questions that they want to answer using our collection. Now, when I first started this was one thing that I didn't really think about, but we actually do get lots of requests from artists who want to see something up close. So we worked with an artist here in Saskatoon who was working on this amazing wood carving of a great gray owl. And he just couldn't get the detail that he needed from pictures. And so he was able to come down, have a look at some of our owl specimens, and make a pretty cool carving. We do lots of education outreach for schools and university classes in Regina. So we get lots of students coming through the collection to just be able to see stuff up close in your hand that you maybe normally wouldn't out in the wild. So if you do want to use something in the collection, like I said, we're totally open to people coming up with research questions and approaching us for accessing some of our study specimens. We do sometimes allow short-term loans, so we can send things out potentially to you, but we prefer researchers to come to the RSM, see what's there, do their own specimen collection, tissue collection. We do allow destructive sampling, so For certain specimens, you can take a little cut from the toe pads of a bird, you can take a feather sample, you can take a fur sample, and those tissue samples that we take are almost exclusively available for research use. That's why we take them, is to for people to use them for different research questions. So kind of switching gears a little bit. So the next kind of objective or mandate of the RSM is to do outreach like this. But we also try to make the data available at the museum more broadly. And so all of the information on the vertebrate collection is entered into the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, GBIF. It's pretty limited to the occurrence information, so where it was collected and when. But if you want to look up the ornithology collection, if you want to look up the mammalogy collection, the owl pellets, all of that data is available for free download off of GBIF. So if you're looking for occurrence information in Saskatchewan, this is kind of one opportunity to get a bunch of information that the museum has. And we're constantly adding to it. We add to it every year. So the other kind of exciting thing that we're working on right now is we're working on something called the Eggs of Canada. So we're taking high resolution photos of trying to get all of the breeding birds in Canada. So we're taking a picture of a clutch and a picture of a second egg of a single egg as a bit of an online field guide for people to be able to try to identify eggs that they might find in the field, but a bit of an online resource using some of the museum collection. So that's hopefully going to be online for those bird people. We're working with Cornell to add all of those pictures to the Birds of the World species account. So that's kind of cool. We do tons of public education and outreach. So you can follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. We were doing some Bird Monday, just kind of talking about different birds in Saskatchewan, trying to get the word out. Like I said, all of the curators are adjunct faculty members. So we teach classes mostly at the University of Regina. We supervise master's students, PhD students, and things like that. We have a really amazing knowledge keeper program at the RSM. So some elders work with us, and we were able to do some neat videos on linking Western science to Indigenous knowledge. So I had the good fortune to work with Alwyn Four Eyes here, who's a powwow dancer and specifically a chicken dancer. And so we did a video kind of linking that powwow dancing to shark-tailed grouse leks, which is the inspiration for the chicken dance. So we get some neat opportunities like that to work with our knowledge keepers at the museum. Of course, a lot of that data that we have on occurrence of species, a lot of that information gets fed to the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, CSIWC, and the Species at Risk Act assessments. And a lot of the curators are experts in the field. So a lot of the pollinator CSIWC assessments go to Dr. Sheffield for review. I review a lot of the bird ones, and Dr. Ray Poulin is a snake and small mammal expert. And so we do a lot of reviews of SARA recovery strategies and CSIWC assessments and contribute a lot of data to that process. The other interesting thing that I never really thought about, but we do also sometimes get involved in wildlife related investigations. So we might have conservation officers who find a bone or find a feather and they need to match it up with the species in order to lay charges or not lay charges. And so sometimes they will come to the RSM to use our collection to compare feathers or bones. We do also get a lot of like, is this a human bone or a cow bone? So we do help with some of that stuff as well, but something that I never kind of thought I would get involved with as a wildlife ecologist, but it happens. All right, so the other thing that, like I said, we're heavily involved with, a lot of us lead our own research programs, mostly in conjunction with the University of Regina, but we're there to support either through expertise, through funding, through leading different research projects around Saskatchewan specifically. So I thought it'd be good just to give you a little bit of a teaser on a couple of research projects that I'm leading out of the University of Regina. So kind of switch gears a little bit and give you something a little bit different to think about. So the first project started last year. We're doing a project on great horned owls in Saskatchewan. And so for those of you who don't know, great horned owls were probably at relatively low density in the mixed and moist mixed grassland. They're probably limited to treed valleys, sometimes cliff sides and things like that, and some small areas of aspen clumps. But now when we look at the breeding bird survey in BCR Bird Conservation Region 11, which is the prairie potholes, BBS since about 1970 suggests that great horned owls are increasing about 1.66 per year. There's about a 0.66 probability of a greater than 100% increase in great horned owls in Bird Conservation Region 11 in the prairie potholes. So one of the few species in this region that's actually going up and not going down. Great horned owls, super adaptable. So they roost and nest in old abandoned buildings. They love to nest in trees that have been planted around old farmyards and shelter belts. They hunt from elevated perches like power poles and fence lines. And their diet is absolutely enormous. They eat everything from small mammals to dogs and cats to grouse to ducks, everything kind of under the sun. If it moves, great horned owls are going to eat them. And so, of course, you kind of have this novel predator in a novel environment. And that can create conflict with things like species at risk management. If you've got owls in an area and they're eating species at risk, that's maybe something we have to kind of think about a little bit. This isn't a still from our work, but it's actually a great horned owl depredating a peregrine falcon nest box. So they have absolutely no compunction to steal large hawk chicks and things like that. They're kind of the great white sharks of the prairie. So our project is trying to answer some questions about what's allowing these owls to be so successful in prairie Canada. What sort of structures are they using to hunt from? And kind of a basic habitat use type study. Like I said, so we're interested in hunting behavior and perch use. So we're putting satellite transmitters on the owls. They do most of their hunting at night, of course, so it's impossible to study just running around trying to see them. So we're using satellite transmitters to answer that question. And then we've got a little bit of a larger project looking at landscape scale habitat use in terms of nest selection of this particular species. And I have an amazing graduate student, Tori Hartley-Cox, who's leading this project. So to give you a little bit of an idea, I had to sort of show some owl pictures. We've got about 28-gram satellite transmitters on them. Me coming from a small songbird background, it's like 28 grams is about the same size as a songbird, but absolutely no problem for these guys. Attached in a backpack style harness. We had to make some adjustments. It's kind of interesting. We're doing work down in areas without cell phone service, so we couldn't use satellite transmitters that hit cell towers. And the owls are most active at night, and during the day they roost in buildings. So solar power transmitters are also out. So these are completely battery powered. They last about 3 to 4 months of really heavy use. They can last longer if we back off a little bit. Kind of neat thing too is you can program them on the fly, so we can change how often they take signals as they're on the bird. So our owls that we trapped, about half of them are in areas that are dominated by pasture land or native prairie, and about half of them are in areas that are dominated by cropland. These are owls that are typically nesting in farmyards and isolated trees in a kind of completely flat cropland homogeneous landscape. And not super surprising, but our owls in native prairie are having to travel a really, really far distance to forage. They're moving 3-4 kilometers away from the nest. Whereas those owls nesting in the farmyard, they seem to be fat and happy, and they're kind of able to just like hang around the farmyard, not travel too far to forage. So kind of an interesting, very different strategy in the two nesting landscape types. So we're going to be putting another set of transmitters on next summer, kind of the same study design, but some interesting results coming in terms of how the owls are moving around the landscape at night. The other thing that we did here is we established a citizen science program. So about a year ago, we started this. And we asked people to report all of their great horned owl sightings. It's really nice to work on a large, charismatic bird that you can't really mix it up with identifying anything else. So we started this about a year ago. I think we have over 600 owl observations from about 300 townships across Saskatchewan and Alberta. So it's worked out really, really well. We're continuing the project for about another year or so. So if you do get some great horned owl observations, please report them to us. And we'll take your observations at any time of year. We're really interested in nesting, but we'll take observations at any time of year. So the other project that I'm involved with is very similar to a project that's going on here in Saskatoon, but we're doing it down in Regina on urban wildlife. So I'm collaborating with a colleague, Mark Brigham from the University of Regina, and we've got another master's student on this project, Jordan Rustad, who's kind of taking over. And we kind of know, urban areas are pretty fast growing. They're starting to change what the landscape looks like. And most of the research in the past, when you look at urban wildlife research, has shown that as urbanization increases, generally biodiversity decreases. So as you kind of go from the outside of the city to the inside, you see a fewer number of species. But when you look at the next picture, try to figure out what might be wrong with that. This is Regina. It's a completely manufactured city, essentially. Every tree in Regina has been planted. There's no natural trees that grow there. They're all super old now. And we're starting to get species like yellow warblers nesting in shrubs and so getting lots of the boreal birds stopping over in the city. And this is completely different from what was here prior to European settlement. It was a swamp, essentially, some native prairie, but no trees, nothing around it. And currently in Regina too, it's completely surrounded by probably one of the most inhospitable landscapes for biodiversity in terms of cropland. And so we're kind of wondering whether or not that relationship might be somewhat different in this particular context. So we've only got 17 stations up right now. We're hoping to double that in the next year. But at each of our biodiversity monitoring stations, we have trail cameras set up. We have ARUs that record for about 20 minutes a day around sunset and sunrise. And then we've also got bat detectors up. So we're trying to get the best picture we can of vertebrate diversity in the city. This is kind of how our study is set up. We've got that urban to rural gradient, and our rural sites are separated into ones that are more natural. So we're in a couple provincial recreation areas where there's some trees, some shrubs, some native shrubs. But then we've also got some sites that are in as bald cropland landscape as you can get. And then we've got some sites in orange that are kind of a 50-50 mix of suburban and urban. And then we've got some sites right smack dab in the middle of the city of Regina. And we're monitoring 1 month every season. So trail cameras, ARUs are up for a full month in summer, fall, winter, and spring. So right now, this is just data from a couple early monitoring periods. On average, our urban sites had about 2 fewer species than the suburban sites and about 1 fewer species than the rural sites. So those suburban areas seem to be kind of a good mix of, there's some tree cover for some of the smaller species, and then some of the larger species like deer are moving in and out of the city to access forage in the cropland. Then they're moving back into the city for cover. So kind of some interesting results that are just kind of starting to roll in. So we've still got quite a bit of monitoring to flesh this out. And everyone kind of asks, what are you seeing in Regina? like Saskatoon. I gave a presentation to the city of Regina about 2 weeks ago, and they were like, oh, white-tailed jackrabbits are the bane of our existence. But yes, quite common in our urban sites and the suburban sites. Nothing like going through 9,000 trail cam images of a white-tailed jackrabbit going back and forth. We have both species of deer in Regina, both whitetail and mule deer. Mostly limited to our rural sites, but definitely fairly common in those suburban and some of our urban sites. Coyotes, very common in our rural sites, but also some of the sites right kind of downtown in the city of Regina, definitely making use of the white-tailed jackrabbit population in this area. And raccoons, we knew they were there, but pretty common in some of our more urban sites. So that kind of covers that. I'm just going to kind of leave with some ideas, again, get people thinking a little bit about collaboration with the museum. And so one of the things that we do, if there are any undergraduates listening or here, we do hire undergraduate students through the Young Canada Works program. We also do sometimes hire co-op students during the semester. I think we pay pretty well relative to a lot of summer jobs out there. So if you're interested in a museum job, we usually advertise in January or February. And students get a pretty amazing experience. If you're interested in natural history, nothing like seeing 50 or 60 different species in a couple days right in your hand. And students get to do a ton of field work. So one day this summer, students were out with me doing urban wildlife stuff. The next day they were out doing invertebrate surveys. And then the next day they were out doing amber collection down in southwestern Saskatchewan. So pretty good broad experience that students get working at the museum. We do, like I said, co-supervise students, undergraduate students doing independent research projects. We're all about that, trying to get people to use the collection. We supervise master's and PhD students. So for myself specifically, I supervise a couple students doing field-based projects, but there's a ton of projects available using the museum collection itself. And did want to kind of leave this with folks. So if you're out and about and you find dead things, we are more than happy to take them off of your hands. I know it's kind of gross, but who's a good biologist who doesn't have something dead in their freezer, right? But you know, that goes for folks, professors who might have a bunch of stuff in their freezer that they're wanting to get rid of. The RSM makes a great repository for that, or the U of S collection. The key things for us is we really, at a minimum, kind of need the date and the location of the thing. That's kind of our currency. We need to know where it came from and when it came from for it to be useful for the collection. And of course, for anyone who's doing wildlife research in the province, you need a provincial permit. And that kind of says that the RSM should be the repository for any dead things that you find. Unless you suspect disease, then it goes to the vet college here at the U of S. But keep us in mind. You can call me to drop things off. You can drop it off at the front desk at the museum. It's a super easy process. They grudgingly take bags of dead things in for us, but yeah. So keep us in mind as you're out doing field work and as you're out doing stuff in the city. Like I said, we collaborate a lot with Living Sky, so you can bring stuff to Living Sky and it'll eventually make its way to the RSM. So I think with that, I will stop. And if anyone has any questions, I am more than happy to answer. And I'll have to remember to repeat the question.
Right, we can try to do the back and forth with me walking around the mic. So if you are online, please put your questions in the chat and we have someone who will monitor that and read them out as they come in. If you are here in person, I will walk up to you with a microphone and you can ask your question directly to Ryan. Okay. Oh yeah.
Okay. In terms of some of the research that's happened at the museum, is there anything that stands out to you in terms of anybody who's looked at historical changes in contaminants or diet?
I will sitting behind you, I think, are doing some of that research at the moment. So they were just up. It was about 50-ish specimens you took samples from. So yeah, we have that ability because our specimens go back to the early 1900s. There is that ability to look at changes over time in terms of contaminants and things like that. So most surprising sighting on the cameras around Regina. Nothing too surprising yet. We're waiting for that elusive cougar to go by or black bear, but that hasn't happened yet. We've seen some cool things like mink, beavers, moose, kind of your typical urban wildlife that you see. So nothing too surprising. Second question, do we have any data on cougars? So we do have a few cougars in the collection. So I don't know off the top of my head, but you're more than welcome to give me a shout afterwards if you're looking for occurrence data on cougars. We don't have that many, but for example, I think we did get one a couple of years ago that was shot around Port Capel in southern Saskatchewan. Yeah, if you do have any questions about cougars, feel free to give me a holler. Yeah, so Phil, what is the process involved in sampling specimens which could be destructive in nature? So we do have a fairly straightforward application. So all that we ask is that you've kind of thought about the typical like animal care-ish type thing, refinement, replacement. We just want to make sure that if you do destructively sample something at the museum, that it's a sample that isn't wasted. So we want you to plan a little bit ahead, provide us with a plan of maybe some other museums that you've approached. But it's a straightforward application to us where we ask you a little bit about what you're going to sample, how you're going to sample it. And in most cases, it's absolutely fine. We do have some rarer specimens, which sampling those are a little bit of a harder sell, but we try to accommodate as much as possible. Is the urban wildlife program you described part of the Leakin Park Zoo's urban wildlife information network? Good question, Matthew. So right now we're following all of the urban wildlife information network protocols, but we don't have enough sites to join the network quite yet. And actually right now we're processing all of our data through the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute Wild Tracks program, not the kind of urban wildlife information network database type thing. Yep. Oh.
Would you guys consider storing stomach or stomach contents?
Yeah, so it's actually one of the, oh, I'm on. Yeah, we probably would. We try to do different smaller projects as we're preparing things. So we do take and try to identify things like parasites in the stomach. But yeah, tissue samples and stuff like that. It's something that we're trying to get into. We're not quite there yet, but it's something that we're interested in doing in the future. And anything as well, like fish scales or stuff like that. We're thinking seriously about getting into that game because we're not actively collecting stuff.
There's one more question.
Oh, yeah. Yes, Andrea. So the vertebrate collection is in Canadensis as well as GBIF. The GBIF data that we provide is pretty limited. So it has, like I said, the lat longs if we have it, or the nearest city. It's got the data that was collected. I think we put things like who collected it. But a lot of the morphological measurements we maintain in our own internal database, which you're more than welcome to ask us to access. And I believe the invertebrate collection is getting added to Canadensis. I'm not sure if it's quite on there yet, but it will be for sure. Bill, what is the process for donating your humpback whale radius bone? Give me a shout. That's right. Yeah, Tracy might want it. So we do try to somewhat. We have to do a little bit of a balancing act in terms of what we take. So something like a whale radius bone might be better stored in a different museum, one that maybe is more Arctic focused or more ocean focused. But in some rare cases, we will accept some of that things. We just had a narwhal tusk and other things donated that we did take in because it was already here in Saskatchewan. But it's a quick phone call to me if you want to donate something, and then we'll decide whether or not it gets added to the collection, or I'll send it to Tracy. Yep.
I'm just curious with your urban wildlife program and in the emergence of so many trail cameras and ARUs, if the RSM is going to be making some of that data shareable that you're acquiring through the wildlife program, or if you guys have given much consideration to, I suppose, being a repository for some of the data that's gathered in the province with those means?
Question. So we're exploring that and realized that that amount of data was simply too much for us to store. So that's why we've put all of our stuff on that WildTrack system. We're stuck a bit in the urban wildlife. We had to do a lot of wrangling around privacy issues with the city of Regina to be able to do that research. So I think our animal data will eventually be available, but we're kind of having to wrangle pictures of people in with that and surrounding privacy issues. They were really good at providing us the permits to do the research, but we had to have a really hardcore privacy protocol for dealing with people and things like that. So so right now it isn't, but we hope it will be for sure in the future. Yeah. Yep.
I'm just curious about your citizen science for the Great Horned Owl project. How are you, when you're taking the observations from people on the QR code, how are you analyzing your results or interpreting them in such a way that you're not getting multiple owls from different people? Like you have 4 owls versus 4 people that saw one owl, the same owl. You know.
Yeah. I totally understand. So we do, when you enter your data, we do ask what type of observation it was. So we do have a specific category for nest. And then if, we expect there to be some type of error around the lat longs that are taken. And so we can kind of assume that this nest is this nest. But we do get a lot of just owls perched, and we're not quite sure what we're going to do with that data yet. That'll potentially be another project. But yeah, people see them all over the place. But yeah, that's because we allow people to record the behavior. We can sort of match nests. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the kind of neat thing, at least the ones in the city are a little bit trickier because tons of people see the same one. But the rural ones, a lot of them are farmyards, ranchers, farmers reporting them to us, so we get one.
Any last questions? There we go. Okay.
Caitlin asked if we have access to eBird records. Yes, so we will be pulling information from eBird directly for this project too, as well as there's a ton of great horned owl hobby banders in the province, and we're also pulling data from them. So yeah, it's shaping up to be a pretty nice data set. Surprisingly, a lot more common than the endangered species that I've worked on.
Last call for questions in the chat, in the room. Going once, going twice. Well, then I'll ask everyone to give Ryan a nice round of applause. We will be heading to Louis afterwards. So if you have burning conversation topics you want to keep chatting about, feel free. But in the meantime, a big thanks to Ryan.